And let, okay, all right, and now I just need to give the official bio. So, oh, it's not working. Give me one second. So, to give some background, Nancy is an associate professor of city and regional planning at the University of Cape Town. Her research and teaching interests explore how socio-technical processes shape space and includes work on smart cities, spatial planning, and infrastructure. Currently, she is working on a comparative project on smart cities in India and South Africa with colleagues from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland and University College London. She's also the current chair of the Association of African Planning Schools, a network of 56 university departments that teach planning across the continent, and was on the founding international advisory board of the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center, and a former chair of the Global Planning Education Association Network. She's got some recent publications, which we'll go into. And today, Nancy will be speaking to us on platform urbanism and hybrid places in African cities. Nancy, I'm going to hand over to you. Welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Margot. Well, like I said, it's lovely to be at WITS. I have great fondness for the school at WITS. I did my PhD there, and many of my former colleagues from UKZN are there, Alison and Phil, and yeah, Amanda, everyone, and friends. So I do feel like I'm amongst friends. So thank you for the invitation, Margot. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And Leno, thank you very much for making it happen logistically. I'm absolutely delighted that so many of you chose to be at the seminar, and so thank you all for coming. Okay, so what I am presenting is essentially work in progress. Some of it explored elsewhere, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But this is essentially part of my ongoing work to get under the skin of what I've always referred to as the real smart city. My work on smart cities started in the early 2000s, well, actually mid-2000s, when I was getting going with my PhD. And then it was fairly sort of limited work, but over the last couple of years, it's absolutely exploded. And there's been kind of all sorts of different dimensions being explored in various bits of literature now that I think is really quite good for the field. I guess the smart city idea has pretty much become like the sustainable city idea. We don't really know what it means. We don't really know what it implies, but we kind of all know, we think we know what it is or how we experience it. I guess part of my work has always been to kind of, like I said, get under the skin of what that might mean at the coalface for people who actually live in real cities. So before the world exploded, I spent a month of my sabbatical, which started in January 2020. God, that year will always be etched in our minds as catastrophic. But I spent a month of my sabbatical time in Kampala and Nairobi to explore a very specific dimension of smartness. And that is the nature of digital disruption and what it might look like in relation to African cities. I kind of always hesitate using the term African city so loosely because, I mean, we're talking about a massive continent with lots of variation. But I guess a lot of the work that I've been doing on this has been in East African cities, in Kampala, Nairobi, and I've also spent some time in Dar es Salaam trying to figure out what all this means. Right, so what I want to do today is explore this notion of platform urbanism and hybrid places, and I'll sort of work through it fairly systematically in terms of how I see the notion of place being either enriched or added to by smart technologies, to put it very simply. Okay, so what's wrong with a smart city? I'm not the only one who's had issues with a smart city who's currently in this kind of, this room of ours, this platformed room of ours. Vanessa's done some great work on this as well, as many others have. But I mean, certainly coming from a perspective that essentially embraces science and technology studies, I've always used actor network theory in my work, hence a kind of very much a relational lens that sees the city as a kind of socio-technical project that's continuously unfolding. I come at it from a very specific perspective. And also there's a bit of the spatial planner sort of thrown in as well, as you'll see as I carry on with the presentation. I mean, one of the things that, the first bullet point here, the power of technology as a transformative agent of change it's a very compelling discourse. It's a very compelling rhetoric, political rhetoric especially. And it's been with us forever. I mean, you just have to read Lewis Mumford in the early 1900s around technology and cities to get a sense of that kind of romance of technology as always being seen as a change agent. And also, yeah, a discourse that has a kind of very, has a very strong pull, especially for urban planners, if we look at planning history. But it is mostly a discourse, and whilst it comes with very particular policy directives, it's sometimes a discourse that can be a threat to livelihoods. And here I would like to refer to Ayona Datta's work on Dholera in India, which gives a very eloquent exposition of how the 100 Smart Cities program that was led by President Modi has had an impact on, on sort of the building of new edge cities, and in turn has had an impact on livelihoods, especially people living in informal settlements that are moved, etc. So there's not really much clarity on what exactly the smart city is solving. I mean, if you look at especially if you look at the corporate literature, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Siemens, I mean, IT companies, management consultants, everyone's got onto the smart city bandwagon. And there's much talk about, there's this thing called the city and it needs to be sorted out. But if you dig a bit deeper, it's very difficult to get much clarity on what exactly the smart city is supposed to be solving. Yes, there's the infrastructure elements, and certainly they're those are quite specific. Things like smart grids and smart water metering systems. But this notion of the smart city as a whole is interesting. And I think if we refer back to our President's State of the Nation address, there's the kind of smart city as a kind of as a solution to joblessness is often touted in this country. But I guess what I'm trying to say then is that the smart city kind of lands in different kind of country contexts in very different ways, often related to local policies and local sort of political rhetoric. And quite often the kind of smart city that you do see in the mainstream visions is kind of bears very little relation to the existing city. I mean, the image that's up on the screen right now is of Konza Smart City in Nairobi, and I'm sure many of us can agree that's not what Nairobi looks like, and that's not what Nairobi will ever look like, or indeed Johannesburg. So yeah, there's often smart is code for gated estates and edge cities in the same way that green urbanism, eco cities, I mean, all those kind of discourses. Smart growth is another one, had sort of implications for urban development and brought with it certain strap lines that were quite useful for private developers to use. But having said all of that, there's as I said in the beginning of the talk, there's an ever-growing literature, more recently critical geography literature that explores the neoliberal underbellies of many smart city initiatives. I don't buy all of it. I think there's more variation in that, but it's certainly a growing literature that crosses scales and disciplines, and recently some really interesting stuff coming out of the global south as well. So my own work and some others, I mean, I just want to give a shout out to an emerging voice in this terrain that I can recommend is Prince Guma. His work on East Africa and Nairobi is really emerging out of the literature. But essentially what we're kind of starting to see, and I would count my work under the sort of this as well, is the kind of urbanist lens that reveals African smart urbanism as more of a hybrid. And I'm going to come back to this term of the hybrid. I mean, really what you see is when you sort of spend time in African public places, well, public places in African cities, is a mix of old and new when it comes to smart, where smart technologies are really entangled with livelihoods and lifestyles, and incorporate it into urban practices. And I've written quite extensively about this. So we're talking about a hybrid, and certainly the notion of a hybrid is not a term that I've coined. It's come up in the smart city literature before with people like Rob Kitchen and Sharon Matten. So yeah, we sort of gradually beginning to understand that what is shaping cities are not the kind of technologies per se, despite claims and corporate visions to the contrary, but the interface between technology and users. And that kind of sounds like a little bit of a kind of straightforward point. But when you start digging at that interface, that's when you can kind of really uncover some interesting work that tells us something about contemporary urbanity, actually, since these technologies are such a ubiquitous presence in our lives. So yeah, so this is the slide with the shameless plug. I've been working on an edited volume with Alessandro Origi, who's at Plymouth University, and what started off as a very straightforward idea of looking at this notion of augmented space through technologies, essentially looking at how we can design public space using technologies, and so that we kind of just have nicer cities, to put it very scientifically. What we found in collecting the chapters for this book, and I mean this book has chapters from 18 different countries, global south and north, is that the sort of top-down design-led interventions that use smart technologies to augment space seldom connect with the qualities of place. That there's, I mean, we've had some of the work's done on Singapore, some of the work on, you know, this sort of places with these very high-tech capacities that are developing twin cities and digital cities that are twinned with existing cities. And that recent initiatives use collaborative approaches to enable broader representation. So this notion of a kind of, I guess, co-productive approach also are sort of emerging, and co-production and collaboration are not the same. I recognize that, but there's definitely a kind of gradual recognition. And this is not just global South stuff. I mean, Alex and I were concerned that this is just a global South view of people saying, well, you know, sort of folks on the streets, street vendors are using cell phones to kind of determine prices of goods. So we're looking at far more of a kind of co-productive presence in urban space. It's not. It's actually emerging in work that we've collected for this volume out of Holland, and then also Colombia, and there's a Cape Town case study as well from VPU. So smart urbanism in place. So we sort of came up with a new title, Designing Smart for Better Cities, which we thought is a much better representation rather than kind of creating places. Excuse me. So if we look at the interface, and I guess what I've described to you on the slide prior to this is a kind of a gradual recognition in the human-computer interaction literature, as well as the urban design literature, two very different fields, but they come together in under the kind of smart bodies of work, that there's a gradual recognition of sort of a far more granular relationship between, or interface between, technologies and users. What drives content is not the technology, but the issues of the day. And this is no big surprise, but it is the result of these interactions that are interesting. So William Mitchell, who was one of the first urban designer architects to write about smart technologies in place, sort of in 1996, spoke, I think I was still doing my master's then, hey Phil. In 1996 spoke of recombination in architecture as a result of the digital age, where parts of buildings can be repurposed through smart means and recombined differently. So the idea of recombination is quite interesting, especially now as we talk about digital platforms, and I'll elaborate on that. But essentially, if we look at smart or augmented or recombined places, what draws people together in public space, if part of community or protest or storytelling, or indeed selling M-Pesa credits, mobile money, or mediated performances, on malleable themes or interests that are threaded through many forms of media. Digital technologies are therefore appropriated and recombined in ongoing urban transformation. And digital platforms are co-generators of place. I mean, the example that I've looked at recently in a book chapter is the work that the Reclaim the City campaign does, or Undafuna Kwazi in Cape Town, and the way that they use social media to tell stories, and how they connect those stories through online storytelling as well as through on-site protest action is fascinating. So we're seeing a kind of far more, may I use the word again, granular sort of evolution of place-based storytelling through a kind of technology mediums, or in conversation with technology mediums. Right, I've already spoken for 30 minutes. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, so yeah. I mean, the work that informs me is I'm very much informed by Sarah Barnes's work. I mean, what I quite love about the smart city stuff is you do get pulled into reading different disciplines. She's a media theorist, and I guess also a geographer, if not a trained one, but certainly an honorary one. But the early work and the coining of the term platform urbanism sort of placed emphasis on the fact that the user is not passive, and that, you know, looking mostly at mobile phone platforms and activism, but more importantly, it recognizes the agency that emerges from the socio-technical assemblages that get formed in the process. So I want to elaborate on this. I mean, especially if you start using terms like socio-technical assemblages, it can mean so much. I just want to quote Sarah here, and where she talks about a read-write urbanism. She published this in her book in 2019 called Platform Urbanism, where she says, engaging with platform services is today an integral part of being an urban citizen, and involves many different kinds of value sharing, not only the value extracted by technology companies. And that to me is a really important emphasis. So the term recombination, as it goes back to William Mitchell's work, where he explored how advanced telecommunications allow artificial adjacency to substitute for physical adjacency amongst activities, and therefore many traditional building types are likely to fragment and recombine, he said in the late 1990s, and he was kind of right. But what he also argued is that built spaces will still be needed for living, work, and recreation. They'll be organized and configured in new ways. And I sort of feel that Sarah builds on that idea. And a lot of it has to do with the way the digital platforms are architectured. There's no such word, but I'm going to use it anyway. I mean, digital platforms are cross-operable. So Lizinski, who also writes quite extensively about platform urbanism, talks about how it's characterized by one platform underwriting a critical infrastructure function of another. In the way that Google Maps digital map platform, for instance, serves to infrastructure the visual interface experience for Uber riders. So these are technical architectures which are implicated in urban infrastructure, and therefore have an influence on urban space. So, I mean, platform urbanism, or the platform economy, as we call it, it's not the same thing, so I shouldn't use the term at all, but the platform urbanism is really, I mean, obviously it has implications if we think of Airbnb, if we think of Uber, the big names, the big tech companies, the multinational tech companies that somehow just land in our cities and cause havoc. I mean, there's obviously implications in terms of labor, the economy, governance, infrastructure, maintenance, social and cultural practices, governance issues, etc. And I guess at the end of the day, there are winners and losers in the shared economy. There's some literature on platform urbanism in the global south. Rather than interpreting technology disruption as new, as a rupture of sorts, I would argue that some forms of continuity are present, and these are particularly pronounced and brittle in the African context. And I guess this view of mine is supported by the work that I've read about Brazil, where work on Uber in Sao Paulo reveals how the continuous uncertainty of the labor market is somehow perpetuated by the sharing economy, and that's no big surprise, but with some really interesting subtleties around that. Andrea Polio has done some incredible work in Cape Town. I'm not just saying that because he's on the call, where he talks about how platform landings intersect with economic and labor histories, questioning those kind of Siliconian normative rationalities. That's one of those phrases that you wish you had thought of yourself. So colonial histories and post-colonial interpretations and relations are actually really important with regard to how platform urbanism evolves in our different country contexts. So then the question begs, and this was my big mission, is if public interventions are scarce, if we talk about public platforms that could perhaps take on a far more sort of, sort of developed platforms that are far more publicly sort of focused, do homegrown platforms offer a closer attachment to place and therefore better opportunities for progressive socio-technical evolution? I guess that's a research question, right? So what I do is I probe these possibilities under the following themes that come on from the next slide. And I do that by examining how some startups and the gig economy evolved in 2 African cities, well, actually 3 African cities. And this was informed by a sort of anecdote, really. I was asked to speak at a conference at Makerere University in Kampala last year, and I shared the platform, the podium, with the Chief Operating Officer of Safe Border. And I'm going to tell you about Safe Border in a minute, and a planner from the Kampala Capital City Authority, who were having a very heated discussion about border riders. So these are motorcycle taxi riders that you see a lot of in the East African cities and in West African cities. So that little sort of skirmish was interesting to me, because basically the planner was saying, you know, we need to get rid of these guys. They're dangerous, they're informal, they're messy, etc. And of course, the Safe Border COO sort of said, well, yeah, you know, you're talking about livelihoods, you're talking about mobility, which kind of made me think about, well, how could these digital practices actually contribute to more substantive urban change, such as mobility, for example? Right, so I've come up with 3 themes of how we can think about digital platforms and place. The first one is a mouthful, where following on from this idea of this agency that emerges from a kind of socio-technical relationship between human and non-human sort of actors or smart technologies and people, you know, how does that agency actually lead to the remediation of public life? What implications does it have for public life? I mean, if we look at these assemblages of material, human, and data elements, digital platforms have really become this banal part of everyday urban life, and their impacts are inherently spatial. How that agency is distributed cannot be assumed to be uniformly in favor of multinational companies. I mean, we see this with the work that Andrea has done in Cape Town, and we will also see it in some of what I've found. So what we're seeing is a kind of more subtle play of power. The software enables local narratives and economic assemblages to shape themselves in accordance with context and city aspirations. So yeah, the material elements of, for example, rider platforms, not only extend to physical impacts on space, but beyond the algorithms are the logistics that require management of the network elements across space, the cars, the drivers, passengers, and payments. So these kind of very material kind of impacts need to be managed, and they are managed, and sometimes in a very interesting and surprising way. So I guess what I'm also saying here is place is not just another platform. Place is kind of part of the dynamic. So let me talk about Safe Border. So Safe Border is a digital platform that was developed by a Ugandan, together with 2 mates of his that are not Ugandan, but it was essentially started by a Ugandan former border rider. And it's a ride-hailing app that was developed in 2015. And the big issue that Safe Border was essentially solving, and the name gives it away, was safety and efficiency, but largely safety. But when I interviewed the CEO, it was also around professionalizing border riders. And that is a direct conversation with the notion of informality. And the term informality came up over and over again. Recently, the Safe Borders expanded, and it's this expansion of services that I think, again, gives us insights into what what some of the kind of spatial elements could be. So they've expanded to package delivery, to the sale of airtime, delivery of medicine during COVID, delivery of food from local vendors. So what the digital platform does here is it enables partnering of complementary services in a quantifiable and formalized framework with some financial predictability, which is great for the riders and it's great for Safe Border. And hence the term kind of professionalization that came up when I interviewed the CEO as well as the founder of Safe Border. I mean, the other element around remediation of public life is how Safe Border is very much locally embedded and inspired. I mean, Deepa, the CEO, said to me, "We believe in what we are doing. Africa needs a localized option." And, that could come across as just a kind of interesting strapline, marketing strapline, but really it's what I did find, for example, is that with the sale of food, like I guess it's the Safe Borders version of Uber Eats, there's a real commitment to selling local, inexpensive food from street vendors, and enabling kind of online payments for local services. And but 2 cloud kitchens have been created. And so, there's an interesting connection of the informal and the informal through the platform. Or as Ricky Thompson, who's the founder of Safe Border, said to me, we want to broaden the web for players that aren't connected to the web. The other thing that sort of cropped up while I was making sense of this work, and it's something I need to probe more carefully, is around this disrupting the stage system. So this is a very direct spatial impact. So stages, for those of you who haven't come across the term in this context, are physical hubs that host 15 to 20 drivers. It's a catchment area for border riders. And in fact, if you look at a map of Kampala, it will actually have stages mapped on the kind of topocadastral, or on the tourism maps, probably on the topocadastral maps too. It's also an institutional configuration. Border associations are associated with each stage. I guess like our minibus taxi associations are associated with particular routes. So it's a hub-based distribution what we have is an existing hub-based distribution sort of system. And what Safe Border is doing is actually starting to replace it with an on-demand configuration. Now, when I probed the CEO on this, she was kind of like, well, it's better for the riders. They don't have to go back to the stage every time to pick up a ride. Not that border riders do that all the time anyway. You pick up someone on the side of the road, but there's an interesting sort of, I guess, an unsettling of a kind of existing system, an existing kind of institutionalization of borders that I think could have implications, although it hasn't come up directly in my findings. There's something about the spatial and social legibility of the stage, where as a passenger, you can just walk down the road and find a stage and you'll get a border. That I think is kind of a little bit destabilized through this process. I mean, my other example is Beba. Don't you love the terms? So Beba I came across quite accidentally, actually, by having a conversation with an Uber driver in Nairobi, not this year, but previous time I'd been to Nairobi. And it's basically a ride-hailing service that was formed by the Drivers and Partners Association of Kenya. So it's drivers, taxi drivers wanting to start their own Uber and have it controlled by drivers. I mean, the quote from my Uber driver, this is before they started, actually, when I sort of promptly interviewed him in the car. He said, like Uber, we started on the street, not the office. But essentially, it's a driver-owned ride-hail app, and now it's starting to diversify, which I think probably comes out of economic need, where they now have owner car hire schemes and bespoke tours. Again, so whilst the broadening of the ride-hailing market space is a formidable challenge for local startups, We can also see this, I guess, as a form of disruptive hacking. I would argue. I mean, this very diversification required to stay competitive in this growing market is also seeds innovation, although that's probably sort of a little bit too kind of rose-tinted glassy. But these are, I mean, I think what makes this really interesting is these are often uniquely local and specific to place-based needs. So yeah, there's also Little Cab, which is more corporate, which also evolved in Kenya. It's owned by Safaricom, that started the famous M-Pesa mobile money sort of phenomenon, and it has become a phenomenon in East Africa, where they've partnered with St. John's Ambulance Services. Okay, let me move on. I know we're probably not on 45 minutes, Margot, because I started a bit late, but I'll sort of speed it up anyway, so we can have.
No, you're fine. You're absolutely fine, Nancy. Don't worry. Keep going.
Okay, great. Okay,
another few
thanks,
minutes.
Margot. Okay, so the second theme that I pulled through in terms of looking at digital platforms and places are around entanglements and scale. I mean, I can't think of a heading that would be more typical of a kind of city planner, right? Entanglements and scale. But anyway, so it's basically what I explore here is how disruption travels. I mean, if, you know, there's a kind of disruptive practice that evolves in a particular place, and then there's learning from that, and then how does that land in a different place, and what can we learn from it? I mean, the footloose nature of platform urbanism, or the ways through which data infrastructures are assimilated into our kind of granular urban networks, reveals the potential for connections that traverse places and yet maintain the same implementation values. Again, an example is Safe Border, where in fact the day that I was interviewing the COO, Safe Border was launching in Ibadan in Nigeria. When I asked why Ibadan, I was told, well, you know, there's a kind of local culture that feels right. The size of the city is more or less the same. Okada drivers have a kind of similar culture. So Okada is the term in West Africa that's the same as border in East Africa. So yeah, there was an interesting kind of conversation that was quite qualitative, actually. So these local interpretations of disruption are, you know, sort of, as I say, they land differently perhaps, but these values travel, and the values that Safe Border emphasizes are around kind of, you know, connecting to the local, protecting the driver, keeping the driver safe. I mean, they're fairly substantive and general, but it kind of struck me that as part of Safe Border's business rollout plan, those kind of values are foregrounded. The kind of, you know, interesting paradox, the values of staying local and yet going continental. Very much informed by people's lived experiences and engagement with context. The other thing is the regulatory landscape. So when I asked why did it not launch in Lagos, it was because borders were banned, or I did the interview in February 2020, actually. So borders were banned in Lagos State in February 2020. Yeah, good luck with that, Lagos State government. I mean, the CEO also spoke about local banking systems, how M-Pesa is kind of, you know, completely ubiquitous in Kenya, obviously. Credit card use is completely accepted in Nigeria, whereas in Uganda, not so much. Cash is king. And also talking about local smartphone uptake, obviously that's very important, and how Safe Border can sort of partner with other services, such as parcel deliveries, etc., and food delivery. And then regulations. That photo was taken when I was on a border at that intersection. We got pulled off by the police, and so I had a great sort of on-site exposure to the relationship between regulation and informality in that regard. But central to, I mean, regulation is obviously central to how platform urbanism evolves and lands in different places, and we see this. Yes, 5 minutes. Sorry, no. Margot.
Sorry, we just lost you for a minute.
Oh, okay. Shall I start on the slide again? Would that be
yes,
okay?
Please. Yes, please.
Okay. Thanks, Margot, for the heads up. So on regulation, I mean, I don't think regulation sounds like something that's quite ubiquitous and the same everywhere, but it's not. It's in the African context, certainly, there's a kind of very close relationship between especially planning regulation and kind of the colonial sort of histories of planning and urban infrastructure engineering, etc. So how a mobility form then is policed in a city is actually quite specific to place. So regulation is central to how platform urbanism evolves and lands in different places, because technology innovation disrupts markets, but it also disrupts regulatory regimes. Safe Border, however, takes a very interesting approach to regulation. And I saw a little bit of that with Beba as well, sort of dynamic, interactive stance. One based on ongoing interaction, on bricolage, to use that term from Ennis from years ago in planning theory, proactive lobbying, and political pressure. And some really interesting work has come out of Kampala about how border is also part of a political constituency. So there's an interesting political game that gets played, which I think sometimes, certainly as a researcher, outside researcher, we not always, you know, you got to probe a bit deeper to get a sense of how all that works. And then the third theme is around the hybrid city, and really just saying about how, you know, in the example of Kenyan rideshare Beba, for example, the usual rideshare network is expanded to include private car owners renting out their vehicles. And then the little cab example of ambulance services impacting the assemblage of healthcare provision elements that enable emergency care. I realize I went through that slide very carefully, very quickly rather. So how, you know, how these kind of different elements that are digital, non-digital combine is obviously also informed by place. So the material elements of the city, the relationships between interest groups, the exchange of information, all of these are recombined into assemblages that may very well disrupt existing relations. Thinking now back to the stage model, for example. Easterling, whom I didn't quote properly there, talks about infrastructure space becoming a medium of information, and she kind of talks about these codes that get shared, and I would argue that these new codes evolve to contribute to a hybrid co-produced urban form. Okay, and then also just talking, I just want to talk about, this is my third last slide, about, you know, co-creating space. I mean, blanket readings of infrastructure systems, such as the deployment of smart in place, runs the danger of ignoring the subtleties and dynamics of hybrid places. And I think that would be, you know, I worry about smart city initiatives that just see it as a kind of plonking down of smart, without kind of understanding those underlying connections. And I think there's an opportunity here to reimagine Mitchell's dream of democratic and citizen-orientated ways of placemaking. And that's really where he was getting at with his ideas around recombination. But there's also, and this is a very quick shout out, well, very quick mention of a case study that I did previously that I've mentioned. You know, there's also resistance to the externalities of platform urbanism that we can't discount. The telling of emotional, technical, political stories through social media can somehow also, you know, be a kind of oppositional force. I would argue that the literature on platform urbanism and indeed smart city writing that focuses on the dynamics of place more generally, and that's what we're trying to address with this book, Alex and I, generally lacks this dimension of inquiry, and hopefully will change. Okay, so to conclude, I mean, what I am arguing for is, I guess, a more hopeful interpretation of platform urbanism. You know, the importance of place embeddedness and situatedness, and that differentiated services have enhanced heterogeneity, but not necessarily address structural inequality. So is Safe Border going to make an impact on mobility in Kampala? I don't know. You know, they seem to think they will, you know, but I guess what we are talking about is an engagement with these kind of structural issues, albeit inadvertently. So the many uncharted futures of platform urbanism are functions of these relationships between algorithms, people, and place. Platforms evolve and can manifest in unpredictable and generative ways. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too warm and fuzzy about this. One has to take a critical lens. I mean, hence bullet point 2. But I do find myself kind of sort of, I was giggling when I read this. So again, Lesinski, in a publication from this year, she talks about the glitches in platform urbanism, and she talks about you know, how do we exploit those glitches? How do we study those glitches? What can those glitches tell us? Or platform cracks? Might they reveal possible urban futures formed in more equitable ways via tactical maneuverings through strategically organized platform urban environments? And I guess what I'm saying is, and I haven't spoken much about Cape Town, but I've done the work. In Kampala, Nairobi, and Cape Town, I would argue these futures already exist. And I find that very encouraging. Right, thank you. Questions?
Super, thank you so much, Nancy. I really appreciate it. I'd like to open it to the floor for questions and comments. So if you can put your hands up using the hand up icon, that would be very helpful. Sorry, I'm not seeing any hands up, so I'll take the privileged position of the chair. Nancy, sorry, I mean, I lost track just a little bit toward the end. Sorry, my internet connection isn't always that stable. But I was wondering what you thought the future of platform urbanism was in places like Johannesburg. I mean, you say you kind of seeing it in Joburg, but sorry, in Cape Town. But what do you think about, you know, kind of the complexities of Johannesburg or elsewhere in South Africa? I was kind of asking what you think is the future of those kinds of ideas in other urban centres across South Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Margot, for kicking off. It always takes that first question, right? Someone will follow. I mean, I mean, it's interesting that I haven't done any work on Johannesburg because it's just such a rich urban environment. I mean, I remember Abdul Malik Simone once saying to me at a meeting, he said Johannesburg is probably the most diverse place he's ever been to in his life, and I thought, yeah, it's probably true. In the South African context, there's I mean, what I'm seeing with kind of platforms is, and especially social media platforms, is that there's a, I mean, I have done most of my work in Cape Town, a little bit in Durban, is that there's a use of platforms for kind of oppositional politics is very interesting, and community mobilization. And quite often those mobilizations are related to place-based issues. You know, whether it's organizing around the removal of people in informal settlements during COVID, or whether it's you know, or whether it's actually organizing in the face of COVID through community action networks, as we're seeing, sorry, in Cape Town, but also in Johannesburg. You know, I think what we're seeing more so in South Africa, because it is such a rich political environment, and you know, we come out, and here again, it's history, right? We come out of this struggle history where there's a kind of heightened awareness of your rights and your right to protest, and we see it in service delivery protests. And I think so much of the promises that are made in local government politics is around these kind of intricacies of service delivery that relate to place. And I think, you know, if those promises are either unkept or misinterpreted, what I am seeing more and more of is that kind of politics finding their way around kind of digital platforms. But of course, we also saw, just with the kind of ride-hailing platforms, an opposition to it, you know, kind of taxi, sort of sedan taxi groups and associations, kind of voicing their opposition. So the kind of winner-loser effect, I think, is becoming quite obvious. And then, of course, I'm curious to see what happens with the smart city in Lanseria. You know, I'm curious to see how it's going to utilize kind of platforms to enable greater integration into the urban fabric surrounding it. Yeah, that's the best I've got, Margot, having not done any work here. I mean, I have done work in Johannesburg at a local government level, but not really on the platform urbanism level. Yeah.
Super. No, that's very interesting. Thanks so much, Nancy. Let me just see. Any other questions or comments? Anyone want to come in?
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Please go ahead.
I see Miriam also raised her hand.
Oh, fantastic.
Nancy, the question that I have is, you speak a lot about place and you talk about it in these very different forms, whether it be physical or kind of abstract or through, the platforms, and then kind of, this relational way. And with my own work of interest in place, I'm curious what sort of literature you drew from when you spoke about place, if at all. Like, did you struggle to relate some of the place theory to the context of Africa or to the cities that you're talking about? I know that you highlight a bit of work like Don Mitchell's work, but just in general, like, was there any sort of discrepancy you found in the literature?
Thanks for that, Lena. I mean, in our conversation at the beginning of when you mentioned your research, I thought, oh, she's going to find this interesting. I mean, I must confess, I haven't read the kind of theoretical sort of geography literature on place for a long time. And I guess as a kind of urban planner, I just assume I know it. Yeah. But what I have found is that there's definitely, when it comes to actually the interface between the digital or the smart city and place, I'm finding that there's a big problem, actually. And this is what Alex and I are finding in this book, in the sense that, I mean, basically, the literature talks about augmented space, and largely led by Alex's work, and others, like Catherine Wills, also at Plymouth University. And then there's some interesting work coming out of Holland as well. But it's somehow, I guess I find it's not relational enough. I find that's the gap to me. There's a kind of, there's almost too much of an urban planner, urban designer kind of interpretation of place, rather than a kind of more relational reading that looks at networks and so on. So when we were putting the book together, that's something we really wanted to address. And when we invited chapters, we sort of emphasized that. And the work that then came to us was the stuff on co-production. Was the stuff on VPUU in Cape Town, a colleague of ours in Bogota talking about the parallels between informality and computerized systems. How there's actually some interesting parallels. I mean, I'm not saying you're gonna have the kind of theoretical piece of the decade coming out of that book, but I think what that book exposed us to, and I was actually working on the introduction this morning, what this book exposed us to is that there is a dearth of literature that kind of connects those kind of less material but more kind of relational interpretations of space, place, and the smart. And that's interesting. And in fact, when I started building the argument around kind of more heterogeneity, around sort of more the kind of political ecology work, I was drawing on work from John Silver and Mary. I was looking at the work on infrastructure, I was looking at energy, because I couldn't find that work in the urban planning literature, and I most certainly couldn't find it in the kind of in the smart city literature.
Thanks.
Okay, sorry, it's a bit of a bubbly way of answering your question.
It's fine. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Lene. Thanks, Nancy. Miriam, apparently you've got a question. I can see your hand up, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I sort of lowered my hand after a minute. My question was around what sort of urban governance policies. I don't know whether this research went into that department, because if you look at the borders or the motorbikes, and in Johannesburg, for example, they're coming with food delivery and shopping delivery facilities. But then what happens is the amenities for these guys to sort of park and wait had not been developed. And I'm beginning to wonder, of the cities you mentioned, have there been any useful spatial strategies that have been developed to almost accommodate these facilities for because the technology is almost moving faster than the city can expand or accommodate, whether it's the drivers. Yeah. Did you come across any city policies around spatial governance that can begin to almost move at pace or more or less accommodate whatever the technology provides in terms of opportunity? I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense, Miriam. Thank you so much for that question. Sorry, the reason I'm smiling while you're asking that question is because of a, you know, I mean, this really is where it becomes messy. I remember when I was in Kampala, I actually went out to dinner with a friend of mine who's an urban planner, and she works for the Kampala City Authority. And yeah, I mean, let's just say that her views on borders were very different from mine. And I guess when you're having to regulate and when you're having to kind of deal with the spatial implications and the development control implications and the public health issues, and you know, then it becomes messy. It's not a straightforward notion of, you know, empowerment versus regulation, evil empowerment versus good good empowerment versus evil regulation. It's actually far more finely tuned than that. But I want to pick up on the part of your question where you talk about how these technologies almost move ahead of us. They move ahead of regulation. And that is something that I did come across quite a lot in both cities. And that is that this notion that, you know, this is now beginning to create spatial dynamics that we as planners and as local authority planners in particular are simply not prepared for. And interestingly enough, I did work 2 years ago on drone technology in Africa and in Dar es Salaam in particular. And similar situation, you know, the aviation industry is saying, well, hang on, we weren't ready for this, you know, and so the reason I smiled earlier is that when I was interviewing folks in Dar es Salaam, when I was looking at drones, and when I was interviewing folks in Kampala, not so much in Nairobi, what came out was the sense of, well, if they don't have the regulations, we'll help them make it. And that's certainly the sense that I got from Ricky is he was just saying, we understand that we're doing something that no regulation exists for, and it's hardly new because Uber's here and Uber border is here, you know, so why should we be victimized? But hey, we Ugandans, let's work together with the government. Let's work with kind of regulations that works for everybody. How that works in practice and unrolls in practice is another story. But there's, I mean, what I came across is a kind of dialogical approach to regulation, regulatory practices that I mean, I think maybe it's a little bit too hopeful, but it strikes me that there's a kind of a conversation. But having said all of that, I think there's a real sense of, you know, we just want to clean this up because this is difficult. What I did find, however, is that, I mean, when I probed my urban planner friend at dinner, I mean, she did say that when they're coming up with a new public transport strategy, and they're now beginning to see borders as an essential part of the transport network, and hence, you know, with the kind of infrastructural provisions for that. And when I probed Safe Border on that, they did indeed say that they were consulted on that. So I think there's some hope there, but it's you know, it's also just the fact that you've had you know, it's like minibus taxis in South Africa. You have a transport form that has evolved because of a demand that wasn't being catered for publicly, and yeah, it sort of moves ahead of what we can regulate. But it's one I'm looking forward to probing. Thank you for that question.
Thanks so much. I've got Bongani. You've got a question, and then it looks like Monica. So let's go from there. Bongani.
Thanks, Marco. Can you hear me? Hi, Marco.
I can hear you, Bongani.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, fine. Thanks, Nancy, for the presentation. It's really interesting from my point of view. I mean, I think the first comment that I wanted to make is that if you look at technology as applied as adopted in the African context, one of the biggest sort of challenges that one have identified, because I work in the same space of technology and transport, is that this technology comes in to extract value and not to create value. I'll tell you why I'm saying this. I mean, if you look at the safe border, from a safe border point of view, the guys have not structured themselves differently. It has continued to be the same structure. What they've added is only to sell other products for these international companies for that can pay a cent or so. Is accessibility that we've created for the big business, but not value that we've created for the guys that are using it. That's why, I mean, you find that in the taxi industry in South Africa, one of the biggest challenges is that there are these platforms, technological platforms that are quite important, but if you look for value creation, it is not. The second part to it is that, I mean, in terms of spaces, for instance, if you look at those, I don't know, the motorbikes in terms of the spaces they occupy, they have remained the same, but have not improved because now you've been able to look at the numbers in which they are located. One way of doing it is to say, if those guys are parked in that area, what kind of infrastructure do you need to look into their vehicles, that they own the infrastructure? You basically now adding, you're creating value for the guys, because a guy who owns one of those things on his own can create that infrastructure for the servicing so that he can lower his input cost instead of, so you basically, from a technology point of view, value creation is helping the guys diversify in such a way that they can create value in terms of in lowering the input cost, and on the other hand, also beginning to formalize them in such a way that you formalize, because once you start formalizing an industry, it can grow in terms of scale. But if you just introduce technology and you leave it informal as it is, it will continue being in that structure. When you've started value, you just leave them as they are and nothing else has changed. That's why these cities spaces are not changing, because we've not added value in terms of how we do this thing. So for me, I wanted to check, because it's a space that I'm working on, to say, how do we introduce technology in such a way that it does not extract value, but it creates value, so that the guys also can be able to see value in terms of how you can then scale up and use that technology to do other things. One of the things we're trying to do is to take
Bongani,
I
think so.
thank you. Okay, sure. Sorry, ma'am. Sorry.
No, that's all good. It's lovely. Thank you.
Sure.
Great, Bongani, thanks for that. Look, I appreciate that. I guess what I'm arguing, Bongani, is a completely different way of looking at it. I'm saying it's not just adding technology. It's kind of integrating technology into ways of doing business, or it's not a term I often use because I'm not comfortable with it, because I'm not an economist, but it's integrating technology in a way that improves efficiencies. Yes, sure. So that, we can argue that has a kind of profit motive, but let me speak to my example, Safe Border. I mean, what I saw was a genuine attempt, or a genuine, not just an attempt, a way that sees technology as sort of improving the efficiency of drivers, not necessarily to create more profit, but to actually make their lives easier and enable greater incomes for them. I mean, I'm looking at that scale. And what I also saw was a kind of genuine connection with sort of the idea of informality as part of a kind of livelihood strategy. And I thought the connections with informal food vendors was really interesting. The creation of cloud kitchens, etc. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't agree with you. And I guess what I'm saying is I come from a very different perspective. I kind of don't see it as a layering of technology. Technology has always existed, whether it was feature phones 20 years ago, whether it was, it's just they're different technologies. And what makes platform technologies differently is because they are so, well, they're insidious and they are so kind of much more malleable. And you're able to kind of get different platforms to speak to each other. But I'd love to have an offline conversation with you about it. Your work sounds really interesting.
Great, thanks so much. And it sounds like that could be a very, very interesting conversation, which I'd like to be privy to as well. Monica, you wanted to raise something?
Yes, thank you, Nancy. I just found your presentation very stimulating, and it's more a question. I don't know if you have a part of your research have included the e-taxis in Nairobi. I've been trying to find a little bit more information how it's structured, and related to Bongani's kind of angle. I also understood that this kind of new forms were a way of actually providing a more grassroots kind of a platform for people using technology, but being able to really form like cooperatives that were run in a sophisticated manner. And obviously from where they could actually derive much better benefits in terms of safety for the drivers, the training of the drivers, and also the service that they were provided to the customers. But the key question is about the e-taxis in Nairobi, if you have any knowledge or any information that I could access.
Monica, I wish I did, but I don't. I mean, I was focusing quite heavily on Beba Beba and a little bit on Little Cab. And then I was also just looking at hubs, you know, the kind of digital hubs that Nairobi is apparently becoming famous for, but apparently as I probed it, it's not working that well. But I can certainly, I do have contacts in Nairobi that I can put you in touch with that might be able to help you with that. But it sounds like interesting work. So I'd love to, again, like Bongani, I'd love to have an offline conversation about that sometime.
Thank you very much.
Great. Monica, Nancy, if you need me to help put you in touch with each other, I can facilitate that. That's no problem.
Okay.
Lovely.
Thanks, Margot.
Are there any other hands or comments or questions that I've missed? Sorry, I can't seem to see hands, and I've got a lot of background noise. I'm sorry. Any other hands or questions? Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks, Mike. So I think perhaps we need to wrap up the session for the moment, if that's okay, Nancy.
That's fine. Thank you.
Great. I'd like to say thank you very much. I really appreciated this presentation. I've learned an enormous amount about all kinds of things which I had no idea about. So thank you very much for expanding my brain and introducing us to also very interesting and new concepts. And we look forward to your book. When's it coming out, by the way?
Oh, November.
November.
1st of November. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, we're
so
quite
hopefully
excited about it.
Good. We'll have a launch for that as well. I look forward to it. Okay.
Good.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. And stay well. Nancy, we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Leno.
Yes.
Cheers. Bye.